Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today for the presentation of the 2021 Q2 report on market issues and performance, which was published earlier this week. Throughout the presentation today, we will pause for questions, so please use the raise hand feature in WebEx if you logged in through WebEx. Please remember to state your name and affiliation before asking your question. You may also use the chat feature in WebEx if you logged in that way. If you dialed in directly, please press #2 on your telephone. The report itself and the presentation, as well as a lot of other very useful material, can be found on the Department of Market Monitoring website. The report itself is at the link below, and the presentation should be published shortly as well. Calls and webinars such as this are recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to listen to the recordings, unable to attend, to listen to the recordings after the meeting. Recordings will be publicly available on the ISO webpage for a limited time following the meeting. The recordings and any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And with that, I will kick off the presentation. As always, this report is the very hard work of a large number of people. I thank them all for a lot of challenging analysis and data manipulation that goes into producing the metrics in this report. As always, the mistakes are mine, and the thanks goes to them. With that, what are we going to cover today? Highlights of Q2 2021 market performance. In very large picture, we had higher prices within the California ISO and the day-ahead market, as well as the real-time markets compared to Q2 of 2020. That had to do with lower hydroelectric production, higher gas prices, and higher outage rates. The settlement timelines changed effective January of 2021. This change has delayed reporting in some areas. I'm happy to say that we are able to report in this Q2 report on congestion revenue rights and real-time offset costs. So I will report on those at the request of several market participants following our Q1 report. Western Energy Imbalance Market highlights: Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, LADWP, Public Service Company of New Mexico, PNM, and Northwestern Energy, NWE, joined the EIM, adding about 14 gigawatts of generation and over 20 gigawatts of transfer capacity. Another subject within the EIM that we have some extended coverage on in the report that I'll include in the presentation today is the resource sufficiency evaluation within the EIM. One of the things that you can see in the statistics that we're presenting is the effect of failures of these tests and subsequent undersupply power balance constraint relaxations, which really do drive price differences between some of these areas. And I'll also mention the expanded DMM role and monitoring and reporting on EIM resource sufficiency test performance and issues. We hosted a call on this last week, as well as posting several special reports on the issue, which are likewise available on our website. And finally, the report covers a couple of the new changes to the market that were introduced in 2021. The first is the second phase of FERC Order 831 compliance, which went into place in June and changed pricing and bidding ranges in the market, as well as the intertide deviation settlement changes, which went in place in February. So we'll cover both of those as well. With that, I'm going to start out with some of the settlement timeline changes just to explain the change that happened. The timeline at the top shows the required settlement timeline that was in place prior to 2021. The timeline at the bottom, and I'm not sure if you can see the cursor on the screen, but timeline on the bottom shows the timeline that is in place today. In addition to some of the statements changing, the other change was in the underlying data system storage. What happened previously is that DMM was able to report statistics based on intermediate settlement statements that were available between statement publication, so that we were able to use intermediate data that was not based on final settlement data. Following the changes in place in 2021, the only data available for analysis is settlement statement data. So there is data available 9 business days following the trade date, and data available at 70 business days following the trade date, more final data. But that is really not final until 70B plus 22 business days, which is 92 business days. So that works out to about 4.5 months following the trade date. Because of that, we are limited in our ability to report on a number of settlements related metrics. I will say there are a few different strategies for this. One is to wait until settlement timelines allow and report on Q1 in the Q2 report. So just to delay that reporting. The other is to report on intermediate, based on intermediate data. So we are trying different tactics for different things. To get to the more sort of applicable, more interesting part of the material today, Q1 and Q2 prices were significantly above Q2 for 2020. It's a little bit hard to tell from the graph here, but you can see that the average prices, the day ahead is shown in blue, 15 minutes shown in yellow, and 5 minutes shown in green, were significantly higher in June compared to the other two months of the quarter. In June, there were 2 heat waves. One was a heat wave, so higher demand, from June 12th to June 20th, which was really a west-wide heat wave, and then from June 24th to June 30th, heat wave that was really focused on the northwestern parts of the WEC, including some areas in the EIM. That is what explains the increase in prices in June. Most of the variation in price from month to month, quite a bit of it is correlated with higher gas prices, which you can see here. This chart is showing average monthly gas prices in SoCal Citygate in red, PG&E Citygate in yellow, El Paso Permian in the southwest, and Northwest Sumas in the northwest, as well as Henry Hub, which is the national index price. There doesn't appear to be much variation given the large spike that we saw in February due to the winter event in February. But when you compare averages quarter to quarter, you can see the tremendous increase at PG&E Citygate and SoCal Citygate, which really does explain quite a bit of the change. Average prices in the day-ahead market in quarter 2 were $40 per megawatt hour, which is an increase from $21 back in Q2 of 2020. 15-minute prices increased from $22 in the same quarter in 2020 to 36, and real-time prices increased from $23 back in 2020 to from $23 to $33. One other note I'll make here is that we're seeing day-ahead prices that are significantly above our 15-minute prices and our 5-minute prices. And that's also a change and something that was not true back in the same quarter of 2020. This is a chart from our, this is a chart that isn't included in the Q2, obviously, since it extends through September, but was included in one of our recent board memos that I thought was worth adding here. What this really shows is the same average prices by month compared to the SoCal City Gate gas price, shown in the black dash line, extended through mid-September when we created this metric for the board memo. As you can see here, there's a very close correlation between gas prices and electricity prices. So this is about a heat rate, implied heat rate of about 10,000. Of course, in addition to gas prices, one of the other factors that really moves prices within the California ISO and across the broader EIM as well are regional supply and demand conditions. One of the other metrics that we watch routinely and report on and included in the board memo are prices at the bilateral hubs. This chart is showing average monthly prices at Palo Verde in yellow, Mid-C in blue, and at PG&E in the dark gray, and Southern California Edison in the light gray. You can see in June we had higher prices on average in Mid-C and Palo Verde. This is an average over peak hours than we did at either of the ISO trading hubs. That has been the case in high price, high demand periods over the last few years. That was the case again in June. Typically our Q2, the Q2 in the ISO features relatively low demand and relatively high rates of renewable energy generation, particularly run-of-river hydro. This chart is showing average generation by fuel type, and I'll point out particularly the hydro here in dark blue, and the solar here in yellow at the top. One of the things that we look at when we're trying to explain prices is the fuel mix, the generation mix that's online. If you think about the supply curve that's in place, many of the renewable resources, run-of-river hydro, solar, and wind, particularly enter the supply stack at a relatively low prices compared to gas and imports, which tend to make up the generation at the net load peak of the day, which tends to be our higher price period. That was true in this period as well. The other pattern that we saw in Q2 of 2021, which is typical of second quarter in the California ISO, were patterns of congestion that run from south to north. Relatively more of the solar generation particularly tends to be in the south, and so we do see south to north congestion rather than north to south congestion, which is more typical of high demand periods. This chart is just comparing average generation. It's a different take on the exact same data from the last chart, showing average generation by hour and fuel type for the second quarter of 2021. Shows the dominance of solar generation in these midday hours, as well as the continued reliance again on natural gas and particularly imports. We find that hydroelectric generation and the availability of that hydro generation has a major impact on prices. The more hydro is available in California, as well as in the other areas of the EIM and the WECC, particularly the Northwest, lower prices tend to be. This chart is comparing monthly averages of hydroelectric generation for 2021 in the red compared to the year prior, 2020, in yellow, and the year before that, 2019, in green, as well as to 2015. The reason we picked 2015 as a comparison year is that that year had one of the lowest snowpack on April 1st. It's one of our lower hydroelectric generation years in the past 20 years. So it looks like, as of updated through September of this year, that our 2021 hydroelectric generation has been lower in almost every month than it was last year, and looks similar to that of 2015. Overall, renewable production was actually up 3%. I'll note here that when we use the term renewable, we are including all hydroelectric generation. We're not making a distinction between large and small hydro. By some definitions, the large hydro is non-renewable, but we do not separate them out in our summaries here. Despite the 38% reduction quarter on quarter for hydroelectric production, total renewable generation was up compared to the Q2 of 2020, and that was due to the increase in both solar and wind together. Q2 historically tends to feature the largest reductions of wind and solar generation. So those are wind and solar resources being dispatched below their forecast. As in other quarters, almost all of that reduction of wind and solar generation, which is often called curtailment, is economic. These are resources that are bidding into the market, often at or below $0, that are responding to price signals and therefore reducing dispatch in the market. That was even more true in Q2 of 2021 than it had been in Q2 of the prior year. This chart is showing our average hourly net interchange by quarter and hour. Each panel is comparing average hourly values to the same quarter in the prior year. So if you look at the final panel here, you can see the average hourly net interchange for 2021 Q2 compared to 2020 Q2. The solid blue lines show imports in our day-ahead market, which were lower in each hour than they had been in the prior year. The imports in the 15-minute market are shown in yellow, again, lower than the prior year. The exports are shown below the x-axis and again increased in every hour compared to the prior year. The net interchange, so the difference in the 15-minute market between the imports and the exports, is shown as the dotted black line, which again is lower on average in every hour. And the net interchange after EIM, so that's energy imbalance market interchange added on, is finally shown in the gray. And that too, was lower in each hour of the quarter. One more chart on net interchange, and then I'll stop for questions if anybody has a question in the queue. Again, if you would like to ask a question, please do so. These presentations are much more fun when they're interactive. Please do just enter a question in the chat, use the raise hand feature, or if you dialed in by phone, press #2. This chart is showing resource adequacy import bids by month in the peak hours of the day. This is going back to 2017, and what you can see, and then extends through August. So the third quarter is April, May, and June. What you can see broadly for 2020 is a change in both the quantity of resource adequacy imports as well as a decrease in the price. So the increase in the percent of those that are bid in at or below $0. There was a change that applied in January of 2020 to all CPUC jurisdictional, California Public Utility Commission jurisdictional resource adequacy imports, requiring those imports to be bid in at or below $0. And that is the source of the change. Roughly 90% of our resource adequacy obligation in the California ISO is CPUC jurisdictional. So there are some entities that are not CPUC jurisdictional, to whom that rule does not apply. And you can see we still have some high price bids. There aren't any questions. I will switch over to outages. We have a number of new charts on outages in the report. And if you're interested, I would suggest you look there. What we saw overall is an increase in the generation averages relative both to Q2 of 2020, but really looking back all the way to 2017. This chart splits between forced outages and planned maintenance outages. The difference there is when the ISO becomes aware of those maintenance outages, and the increase here really does appear to be predominantly in the forced outage category. And one of the ways that we split this data a little bit differently is to look at it by fuel type. What you can see is that historically, and this is true in Q2 as well, most of the outages that are taken are for natural gas as well as hydro. We saw an increase, though, in all outages from almost all fuel types, but particularly from the hydro and natural gas. This metric reports on the structural competitiveness of the ISO market, day-ahead market in the second quarter. actually it reports on it by quarter all the way back to 2016. This chart is showing the number of hours in the quarter with the residual supply index less than 1. As a reminder, the residual supply index is a ratio of the available supply minus the supply of either 1, 2, or 3 pivotal suppliers to the demand in that hour. Particularly striking in this quarter, what we see is an increase in the structural number of structurally uncompetitive hours in Q2 relative to prior years, but for both the RSI 1, 2, and 3. So that's an indication that the market is more concentrated. It does not indicate that market power was exercised in the quarter. Finally, and I think this rounds out a lot of our pricing metrics, we looked at the prices this quarter on average by hour compared to the net load, which we've been doing for probably 5, 6, 7 years now. The net load is a comparison of the real-time market requirement less utility scale wind and solar generation on average, and it's shown in the red dashed line. Average hourly prices are shown in blue for the day ahead, yellow for the 15-minute, and green for the 5-minute in comparison. As has been true over the last years, over recent years, we see a very close correlation with net load in average prices by hour. We also, and this has also been true, see the most separation between day ahead and real-time prices during the net load peak. I'll take this opportunity to mention our resource that's available on the ISO website, which I recommend highly to anybody who's interested. The ISO has published monthly reports for June, July, and August of 2021. They will publish a monthly report for September as well. As noted in their report for June, the price differences between the day-ahead and the real-time market were highest in the highest priced, highest demand days, really during that heat wave period. That is also a pattern that we've seen in prior years as well.
And you do have a hand up. I don't know if you want to pause for a question since it just popped up.
I'd be happy
to. Is that Marco? If you can, perfect. Thank you.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
We can.
Is that Chris?
Yeah. Hi, Amelia. This is Chris Devon from Customized Energy Solutions. I just had a quick question on the outage reporting. Thanks for all this good info. I just was wondering if DMM had any interest in maybe doing a little bit more granular breakdown, if there was a possibility that in the future you might think about just providing some information only for the RA fleet specifically versus just the entire fleet itself, and just to be able to maybe compare between the RA outages and the non-RA outages and see if there's any different trends on there for that sort of thing. So just curious.
Thanks, Chris. That's actually a good question. You can put that. We do something. We do publish stats that would allow you to do that. We do that in annual report and are planning to publish these actually in the Q3 report, which should be out towards the end of November. What we do is publish RA performance data for it's usually the top 210 hours of the year or the quarter, and those show the outage rates during those top 210 hours, but which you could compare then to the average and calculate some differences. But I appreciate that as a note, and I'll see if we can come up with something a little bit cleaner.
Yeah, maybe I just didn't notice that specifically called out in those annual reports, but I'll go take a look at that and see there. I think it might be helpful to maybe have that stuff presented alongside with this other kind of info in the future, but just a suggestion to consider. Thanks for your time, Amelia.
Sure. Absolutely. One of the other features of the market that has really been consistent going back to about 2017 is the use of imbalance conformance adjustments by California ISO operators in the hour-ahead market and the 15-minute market in the peak net load hours of the day. This chart is showing 2021 hour-ahead conformance in red, 15-minute market conformance in green, and 5-minute conformance in blue, compared to the same average hourly values for the year prior. Same color by market, but shown in dotted values. You can see comparing in the peak net load hours, on average we have higher bias in Q2 of 2021 than we did in Q2 of 2020 for both the hour-ahead and 15-minute market. A note on this to preempt a question I think I'll get from Chris or others. We have received requests to publish much more, to publish data essentially on the distribution of imbalance conformance rather than the averages. And we are going to do so in the, I think we're going to be able to do so as part of the additional reporting that we're doing on the EIM resource efficiency testing. California ISO operators use imbalance conformance, but this tool is also used by a number of the EIM participating areas as well. The pattern, the scale of the use in the California ISO is significantly bigger than it is in the other areas. And so there's been a lot of interest in it. One of the reasons that we have seen, we think, a persistent difference between the 15-minute market price and the 5-minute price is this average difference in imbalance conformance. These are essentially adjustments on the demand side of the market. So we're seeing on average about 1,000 megawatts of additional demand in the 15-minute market in net load peak hours of the day. The ISO board has approved, and the ISO is planning to make some changes to the flexible ramping product procurement, move to a more locational nodal procurement model. There have been some public statements that there's, I think, a hope with that nodal procurement that the need of operators to rely on imbalance conformance, such as this, would be reduced. DMM has a long-standing recommendation that the ISO consider a longer-term uncertainty product than the current flexible ramping product. The current flexible ramping product looks at uncertainty between the 15-minute market and the 5-minute market, or between 5-minute market intervals. As an interim measure, the ISO in November of 2020 introduced a minimum area requirement to the flexible ramping product. That was introduced in the 15-minute market, for the 15-minute market product only, and not for the 5-minute product. DMM recommends implementing consistently in both markets. The chart on the left is showing the frequency of the minimum area requirement binding in the California ISO, which you can see is on average over the time period about 90% of intervals in the upward direction, a little bit less between 80 and 90 intervals in this percent of intervals in these months in the downward direction. So binding almost all the time in the up and the down direction. When that requirement is enforced, what it is requiring is that the flexible ramping FRP, the flexible ramping product awards be given to resources within that area. So if the demand is coming from that area, the awards be given to flexible resources within that area. The chart on the right is showing the frequency of this minimum area requirement binding by month in other areas of the energy imbalance market. Upward ramping is shown on the left, and downward ramping is shown on the right. As you can see on the right, the frequency for Pacific or East has grown, reaching a peak in June of about 14% of intervals. But again, that's only the downward ramping product, and it's still significantly less than the percent of this constraint binding for the California ISO. We saw a pretty dramatic effect of that area level constraint on 15-minute market prices for the flexible ramping product. This is showing the monthly frequency of positive prices. So in the way to read this, in June, see if I can get the number to pop up. There were almost less than over 99% of system level FRP shadow prices were zero on a system level. This is showing an increased frequency after the addition of that area-specific constraint for positive prices in the ISO, where that constraint was frequently binding. That dropped off significantly in June and May. And on May 9th, the ISO made a change in their system that allowed all 5-minute dispatchable resources to be eligible for FRP awards. Some of these resources had not been previously eligible before, particularly the renewable wind and solar. And after those resources were made eligible, since that change, all downward FRP prices have been zero. We essentially added so much additional supply that we have not seen a positive shadow price since. This chart is showing the average impact of congestion on California ISO DLAPs in the day-ahead market. Overall, the congestion rent calculated for day-ahead in this quarter is $98 million, which is a little higher than Q2 of 21 of $90 million, but roughly similar. What we do see as I mentioned at the top of the presentation today, is that the pattern of congestion is different on average in Q2 than it typically is in our high demand periods that we typically see flow from the south to the north, and we can see patterns of congestion again from the south to the north. So raising, where that congestion is raising prices in PG&E and dropping them in the southern areas of the system. This is a chart that we did not include in our Q1 report due to the settlement changes that we decided to include based on participant demand. So just note here, your vote counts. If you let us know that you are looking for something, we do respond to that. This chart is showing congestion revenue rights auction revenues compared to auction payments. The auction revenues are shown in blue, the auction payments are shown in green, and the total ratepayer losses are calculated as the yellow line. In the Q2, we estimate that about 17 transmission ratepayers lost about $17 million. The difference there between the auction payments revenues and the payments to those rights holders was about $17 million. And that's about 12% of day-ahead congestion rent. The values for Q1 are about $4.1 million of losses, which is about 2% of day-ahead congestion rent for that quarter, so much lower. Overall, we've seen a reduction in losses to ratepayers following the changes that were made effective Q1 of 2019. So Track 1A and 1B changes. Track 1A reduced the pairs of nodes that could be traded, and Track 1B reduced payouts on any particular pair of nodes, limited those payouts to the congestion collected on that pair of nodes. These are estimates, but our estimate for Q1 of the impact of that Track 1B change is that it saved transmission owners about $15 million. So losses to ratepayers could have been significantly about double without those Track 1B changes. So again, these are based on interim settlement values and can change. So we will re-estimate everything and rerun for the annual report, which will come out in about 9 months. One of the other metrics that there was a demand for was our real-time imbalance offset costs metric. These totaled, for the first half of 2021, these totaled $84 million. That is the highest cost for a combined Q1 and Q2 since 2014. As a reminder, in 2014, there were market changes that significantly reduced imbalance offset costs. Prior to that time, there was settlement of supply, sometimes at an hour-ahead price, and demand that was not settled at that same price, which could create quite significant offsets. These, part of the reason we have been hesitant to publish these is that they can change significantly. Initial settlement of these are very directly pulled from settlement values. The initial pull of the Q2 imbalance offset cost for 2021 was done in June, late June, early July. and the initial estimate of that was about $12 million total. The final value that we published was pulled in September, with almost all of the Q2, in that at least T plus 70 business day period, and the total offset increased almost double to about $25 million. So it's that. That is part of the reason for our hesitation in publishing some of these kind of initial values, is that they can change substantially with resettlement. The Q2 values that we're reporting here were the best available data at the time of publication, but these two may change going forward. That is the.
You had a question. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
A hand popped up when you were chit-chatting, so I didn't know if that was pertinent to what you were discussing, from Dan Williams.
Sure. Go ahead, Dan.
Hey, Amelia. Going back to the FRP section that you had, I think it was maybe 25 on the pricing, or 23, yeah. I saw in the report that you noted, and appreciate you mentioning, that change in the CAISO allowing wind and solar to provide FRP and the impact that had on prices. I haven't been able to find anything in the BPM meetings or elsewhere that identified how and why that change was made. Are you aware of sort of how that happened, or what was maybe communicated to the market around that?
I am not aware of any market publication around that change. I will say that it took us by surprise, because it didn't come out of a stakeholder, sort of open stakeholder discussion. And it took the analyst who put this together asking around the ISO and determining asking for confirmation on the dates and the content of the change. To the best of my knowledge, there is not any public documentation of that change beyond the sentence or paragraph that we put in the Q2 report, which was reported based on conversation with an ISO employee, staff person.
Okay. Thanks for that additional color on it. I guess kind of going forward, as we get to the phase 2 of the FRP enhancements implementation, where you get to the nodal deliverability constraints, and I believe it's been a while since we talked about it, so this is off of memory, but just believe that the CAISO is going to be sort of distributing the uncertainty requirement out to the nodes that are driving that uncertainty requirement. And from what I can remember in the discussion of it, those were going to be effectively distributing the requirement out to the VERS nodes, and where they're sort of concentrated across the CAISO system. So I guess I would just be curious, and DMM kind of digging into this one as we're working through that implementation to develop some feedback or opinions on the appropriateness of allowing the resources that create the uncertainty to then provide the solution to that uncertainty. And I may be characterizing that wrong, but it's just, without more information, it's sticking out a little bit.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. I am going to, I'll take that back and we'll work on that. I'm going to speed up a little bit because I have a few new charts in here that I'd really like to share. I think I've got about 10 minutes remaining. EIM, the big picture here is that the LADWP, PNM, and Northwestern Energy joined April 1st for the first two, and June 15th for Northwestern. When these entities join, they add additional transmission capacity to the EIM, as well as additional generation. And it's that ability to really transfer energy between areas that's one of the benefits, the key benefits of the EIM. This chart is showing average prices by month, and I will just note here that where we're seeing the highest prices across the quarter is in the Northern California areas of the EIM. The gray dash is PG&E, and the other two are bouncing area of Northern California, including SMUD, and Turlock Irrigation District. This chart shows prices in the EIM broken down by component. On average for the 15-minute market over the quarter, the total price is shown in the line, and they're ranked by average price from high to low. The blue component is the system-wide energy price, which is the same in any interval across the entire system. The yellow is showing congestion within the CAISO, and you can see that raising prices here in some of the northern areas, lowering it in the 15-minute market, and some of the southern areas, even outside of the California ISO, because the energy imbalance market in part is allowing EIM areas to benefit from some of those internal CAISO constraints. And so we do see the impact of congestion on those constraints outside of the California ISO as well, and showing congestion on EIM transfer limits. So these are the separation within the energy imbalance market of that transmission capacity within the energy imbalance market, shown in red. Congestion rents on these EIM transmission constraints are in fact returned to the entities that provided that to the energy imbalance market. The green component here is the greenhouse gas component, which creates lower prices outside of California in intervals where there's net EIM transfer into California in the market. And so you can see that, in fact, is lowering prices outside of California, in the areas outside of California. That, too, is returned back to market participants in those areas as a measure which would allow them to comply with the obligation. When we look at average hourly prices, 15-minute market, and I realize this looks like spaghetti because we are getting so many areas, even though we combine a number of them. What really pops out of this graph, both 15-minute and 5-minute, is the high prices in Nevada, particularly in the net load hours. When we use the same kind of metric to look at average hourly prices, and we didn't put these in the report for every area, but we did for, I think, four or five of them. It's a really useful way to look at prices because it shows what creates that price separation in between areas in the market on average. And you can see in that, particularly in that high price hour, what's happening is that we have congestion on the Nevada EIM transfer constraint. Looking more closely into that, those intervals, what you can see is that the relatively high frequency of failures of resource sufficiency tests can then lead to limiting of transfers. Those limited transfers may then result in a power balance constraint violation, so the market seeing less supply than demand in that area and then solving for a penalty price. For most of the quarter, penalty prices were set under Phase 1 of FERC Order 831 compliance at $2,000 a megawatt hour. So that is what explains the high cost of congestion, particularly on EIM transfer constraints in Nevada in the peak load hours. EIM sufficiency tests are a subject of a lot of interest right now. The two tests we talk about and report on the most are the bid range capacity test and the flexible ramping sufficiency test, because these two tests do change inputs into the market. There's an expanded DMM role in monitoring and reporting on these. We have special monthly reports that we just published and hosted a call on last week. All of that is available on the DMM website. We are looking forward to publishing our next monthly report, I think next week. We are continuing to work with stakeholders and the CAISO on developing reporting metrics and analysis. So if you do have input on that, something you would like to see, please do let us know. The easiest way to contact us is at dmm@caiso.com. So feel free to go ahead and use that email address. We'd also encourage you to submit comments in the ISO's ongoing stakeholder process. 2 issues were corrected in February 4th. The ISO then added net load uncertainty to the bid range capacity test on June 16th. Since that addition, so from June 16th to the end of the quarter, we noted that most failures were caused by that addition of the additional uncertainty component to the demand side of the bid range capacity test. There's an ongoing discussion about other changes, other enhancements or changes to the resource sufficiency evaluation, and that entire discussion is available in the ISO stakeholder initiative. They are hosting a call on that. Was originally scheduled for Monday next week, but will be held on Tuesday. So if you are interested, I'd encourage you to attend that. I am going to speed through. This chart shows the average number of failures in the over a rolling year in the black dashes, and shows the impact of those upward failures. So the percent at which transfers were actually capped by the failure of the test. Particularly noteworthy is the difference between the 15-minute market and the RTD for the California ISO. Here you can see that in 70% of market intervals, that failure is making a difference for CAISO. In the FMM, but only about 20% of intervals in the RTD. And this, we believe, is correlated with the difference in the imbalance conformance there. This chart is showing the balancing, underscheduling, and overscheduling penalty payments going back to 2019. DMM has an overall recommendation that this test be reassessed, whether it's necessary or not. Over the entire period, the complete penalties are paid and then allocated back out to participating entities based on load share. So the total penalties add up to about $5 million over the period. And I will just end up here with FERC Order 831 compliance. Phase 1 was implemented in March 20th. Phase 2 was implemented on June 13th. Until Phase 2, any PBC was set at $2,000 per megawatt hour. Following Phase 2, there are conditions in which the PBC violation price can rise to $2,000 per megawatt hour, but those conditions have to apply for that to take place. There are also additional conditions put on bidding between $1,000 and $2,000. And with that, I will stop for any questions because I realize I'm a little over time.
We have no questions at this time.
All right. Thank you all so much for your time. And thanks to Chris and Dan for the questions. If there's any additional feedback, please do either feel free to contact me directly or send an email to dmm@caiso.com. Thank you all for your time today.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.